So we've been discussing the various factors that shaped these gendered routes when we described Asian American immigration during this time. We discussed those found in the home country of China, and now we could shift to those factors found in the host country, and of course that's the United States. And this basically connects to something that I described earlier, and that's to say the economic logic of American commercial interests. So here, we're not talking about traditional culture in China. We're talking from American capitalism's point of view. And as we previously noticed, well, American labor recruiters initially wanted physically strong and single, unattached male workers, able to survive the rough conditions of work, able to tackle, the physical demands of the job. So, according to Western gender norms, and here there is a cultural aspect to this, well, there was a belief that women basically lacked the capacity, physically speaking, to do hard work. The nature of work that's entailed in this kind of labor in the U.S. industries in the West. And indeed, many American industrialists actually believe that if a lot of women accompanied the men to the United States, well, it would serve as a distraction to the workers. So that's why they went with this gendered labor force of men. So this brings us to this term, which I have to admit is a bit outdated when you study Asian American history today. But in the formative years of Asian American history as an academic discipline, we're talking maybe the 90s and 2000s, this term was used quite often. And that's the term bachelor societies. And it is suggestive of this labor force comprised of young men who are, for the most part, unattached, unmarried. So it does apply quite accurately. So statistically, we could see just how sparse this immigration of women was when examining the number of Chinese women immigrants here. There were only about 9,000 Chinese women who migrated between the years of 1849 and 1882. And compare that with the number of Chinese men migrating to the United States, and that number is at 332,000. So obviously a very skewed and imbalanced ratio when you think about it. Now, during this period, there were basically three types of Chinese women that migrated to the U.S. West. When you look at the numbers, the majority of them were indeed prostitutes, but then you also had some indentured servants and a smaller number of merchant wives, like I've been discussing. All right, so first let's discuss the prostitutes. And as I just noted, a significant number of Chinese female immigrants during the 1800s were poor girls who had been sold into prostitution. Now, by the way, that's one thing that's quite accurate in, let's say, Hollywood Western films. In general, is the prevalence of prostitutes in the West. And I'm not talking about Chinese alone. I'm talking about in general. In fact, quite a few women in the United States, out of sheer economic necessity, decided to journey to the American West, where again there was a highly imbalanced sex or gender ratio to begin with. So the West was a place where women were scarce, and this is also a place where men often had easy access to wealth during the early years of the gold rush. And also another condition in the West was a general lack of social and moral restraints compared to the East. So that picture of the, saloon and the brothel upstairs is quite accurate in, for example, those Western movies that Hollywood produces. Now, whereas the majority of American and white prostitutes came to San Francisco as independent professionals, and they worked for wages in the brothels, just like any other wage worker. Well, the Chinese prostitutes were almost always imported as slaves or indentured servants. Okay, we're talking about unfree labor. And we're also talking about this trans-Pacific sex slave trafficking. And this is tragic, right, for these women. Indeed, most were kidnapped and lured or purchased, again, from poor parents in China. By some accounts, they were paid for as little as $50 and then resold in the United States once they got there for even more money. In fact, let me read you a testimony from a Chinese prostitute who was interviewed in San Francisco, and here's her account. Quote, "I was kidnapped in China and brought over here. The man who kidnapped me sold me for $400 to a San Francisco slave dealer, and he sold me here for $1,700. I have been a brothel slave ever since. I saw the money paid down. I'm telling the truth. I was deceived by the promise I was going to marry a rich and good husband, or I should never have come here." Unquote. So again, a very tragic existence for these women. Now, according to various studies, over 90% of the Chinese female population of San Francisco worked as prostitutes in 1860. But then you see decline from there. In 1870, you see it roughly around 72%. And by the way, this is according to a U.S. census taking. And then moving forward to 1880, you see it decline quite precipitously to 24% of the Chinese women in California being classified as prostitutes. And we'll discuss the causes behind this decline very soon. Now, the next category, and not far from the reaches of prostitution, to be honest, were the indentured servants. And the name here in Cantonese was Mui Chai, and to be honest, I don't know how to pronounce that. Translated from Cantonese to English, it means little sister. And who were the Mui Chai then? These were girls brought from China to work as domestic servants or indentured servants, right, in the more affluent, wealthier Chinese homes, or even the brothels. So this was a cultural carryover from China and then brought over to the United States for the, again, wealthier merchant families, especially in the U.S. Now, traditionally, this system was regarded as a form of charity, kind of what I described earlier, right, for these impoverished girls. It was a form of adoption, if you will. And indeed, the term comes from the Cantonese, meaning little sister, so it's kind of suggestive of a family relation even, right? Now, this tradition is old in China, whereby the poor parent would sell the young daughter into domestic service, and usually it ended when she got married, when she reached an age appropriate for marriage. And in this system, the girl received no wages for her labor. She wasn't at liberty to leave of her own free will. I kind of discussed that earlier, right? No mobility. Had no legal recourse for complaints should she be mistreated or abused or even raped. Now, as I described earlier, this system was supposed to be benevolent to the girl. They were supposed to be well-fed, clothed, and sheltered, and so forth. But really, the terms muchai and slavery, well, they're almost synonymous. At best, the girl could hope to be married to a good provider and be freed at that point. But at worst, they could be sold into prostitution. And indeed, you could easily imagine some of the prostitutes that ended up in San Francisco used to be muchai in China. Now, this practice of muchai, uh, however, would eventually vanish in the American Chinatowns, and that was due to the efforts of American missionaries, these Christian missionaries, and Chinese reformers as well, who sought to modernize the Chinatowns. And we'll discuss the role of these Christian missionaries, and they call themselves the progressives, which we'll discuss in a second. And also interesting to note that this muchai system actually lasted in China and other parts of Asia like Malaysia and Hong Kong until the 1940s, when it was finally prohibited by law. So the third category here are the merchant wives. And again, they're the smallest segment of the Chinese women in the United States, the wives of merchants and the well-off Chinese in the United States. Now, as previously stated, by 1870, the percentage of the Chinese female population who were prostitutes declined significantly due to what I just described as anti-prostitution measures. And at the same time, more and more of these merchant wives began to arrive in the U.S. So the percentage of merchant wives would steadily increase inversely to the decrease of Chinese prostitutes. Okay, now within Chinatowns, you have to remember that they retained the patriarchal structure within the family, right? Even in these merchant homes. So the merchant wives obviously occupied a higher status than the muchai and, of course, the prostitutes, but they're still considered the property of men and therefore led constrained lives and restricted lives. And it should be noted here that the merchant class in the American Chinatowns, they became the ruling elite of the Chinese in America eventually, right? Of course, that's going to be the case because they're the wealthier Chinese. And since many of the laboring class were unmarried, well, it was really the merchant class that formed the basis of the growth of the Chinese American population and the formation of the middle class. We also have to think about the fact that the laborers are sojourners, so they're not permanent settlers, most of them, right? Certainly not all, but most of them. By the way, you may see this expression here, bound feet. You may have even heard of that. Okay, this refers to the small feet that many of the wealthier women, the upper class women, for lack of a better term, in traditional China, it was a practice that was observed among that social class. And what would happen here is that they would, from a very young age, tightly wrap their feet throughout their whole childhood to the point where their feet became deformed and they became much smaller than the regular feet that weren't bound, right? And therefore, it would come out deformed, and the bones would be drastically disfigured. And by the way, you could look this up on Google Images, and you'll see it. It's, for most Westerners, it's not a very pleasant sight. Okay, but what I want to emphasize here is the bound feet is really a metaphor here. Sure, it was perceived as a sign of beauty, right? It was seen as a sign of beauty for women back then. But when you think about it, it also restricts women physically, right? Remember I mentioned that these women had no mobility in society. Well, here's a way to physically restrict them, right? To constrain their movement and therefore constrain their lives within a patriarchal society. So it was really the merchant wives with their bound feet who led more or less reclusive lives in Chinatown.